Hey folks, I'm Dan. I have a cup of coffee and a story to tell you. So recently, there was a news article about a truckload of monkeys that overturned somewhere in the South. I don't remember the state exactly, but they all got out and were running through the woods. I think it was Mississippi, which is sad in its own that these monkeys were injured. But it reminded me of a story. It was the year 2000, Y2K. We were living in a little town of Bandon, Oregon, on the Oregon coast. And by little, I mean it was about 1,200 people then. But it was a beautiful place, right on the beach. We loved it there. Small town. Kids were in the school, small school. And one day, this was just before school started, actually. No, maybe it was just after. It was about that time of year it starts to get cold. My son comes downstairs, and I realize he had grown so much over the summer that his long pants now looked like capris. And I said, son, we need to go to town and get you some pants, because there was no place to buy clothes there where we lived in Bandon. We had to go to this town of Coos Bay, about a half hour north. So we get in our little Volkswagen Rabbit diesel, and we head north to Coos Bay. And it's a little Volkswagen Rabbit diesel, so it's not a quick trip. Now, in this little car, it was old and rusty, and it had belonged to my dad for years. We didn't really have a radio in it. The radio didn't work. That's because the antenna had rusted off. But it had a tape player, except the tape was jammed inside of it, and I think it was Neil Diamond's greatest hits. You know, you only listen to Sweet Caroline and whatever so many times. And so on this road trip of 30 minutes, we took off. We had a game that we would play. Now my son at this time was, 12 maybe? Something like that, 12, 13. And we were heading north towards Coos Bay. And on this road, it's on Highway 101, which is this famous highway that travels along the coast up California and Oregon, and all the tourists take it. Well, this section of Highway 101 is probably the most butt ugly section of the highway. It goes inland about 10 miles and through clear-cut timber and goes by the dump and over a couple of hills and stuff. It's not the most beautiful drive. So to entertain ourselves, we played this game called Name That Roadkill, because at this time of year there was always a lot of roadkill. So we came up over the hill, and the way this game worked, whoever spotted the roadkill first would call out what they thought it was, and if they were correct, they would win that round. And when we got to Coos Bay, I would usually reward the kids when they played it together, who would go to Taco Bell and they'd get a bigger drink or something. But it was just something to do because the radio didn't work and we didn't want to listen to Neil Diamond. So we're on the way. First pile of whatever it is comes up. I know this is kind of a gross game, but when you're doing it with a teenage boy, it's kind of fun. He guessed it was a possum. He was right. He won that one. We go over the next hill. I guessed porcupine. No, it was a raccoon. I lost that one, so he got the point. We come over the next hill, and once again, I went with raccoon. It was actually one of those gray bathroom rugs that had fallen out of someone's truck on the way to the dump, so that was a draw. And then we go over the next hill, and we're about to get to Coos Bay by this time, and there's a big pile. I thought probably a deer, because there was a lot of deer hit there. And this was a logging area, so things would get hit by log trucks. It was hard to tell what was left. Well, we couldn't identify what it was. And we even slowed down to look at it. It was right in the middle of the road. I had no idea. It was just roadkill. We went on to town, went to Walmart, got him a couple pairs of pants that actually came down to his ankles, got some lunch, headed home. Well, on the way home, just before we got to the flats where the last pile of debris was, he asked, Dad, what do you think that is? I go, I don't know. I said, if there's no traffic, maybe we'll slow down and we'll take a look. So we slowed down a little and looked out, and it was, we didn't know. It was just fur and stuff. So as we drove on up the hill from there, we had about another 20 minutes before we get home, and I got this idea in my head. I looked over at him, I said, I know what that is. And he looked back at me because he knew I was about to give him a load of BS, but in our family, we would do this. We call it Newmaning each other, where if you tell a story with enough authority in your voice, we found that a lot of people would believe it. Well, not that we tried to do it on purpose, but maybe it came from me and Grandpa, who knows. So I said, I know what that is. That's a Japanese mountain monkey. And he looked at me like, yeah, you're full of it, Dad, but I want to know what's going on. So he goes, oh, tell me more. So I said, well, this is what happened. I heard about this. You see, these ships were coming into the bay, to Coos Bay, where they would load up with wood chips and lumber. And they came from Asia. And I said, this is what I heard, is that these sailors, they were bringing over these Japanese mountain monkeys, and they were selling them on the black market. And what had happened, I heard, is they heard the Coast Guard was coming to inspect them, so they grabbed these mountain monkeys and they just threw them overboard when they got into the bay. But these guys can swim, and they swim to shore, and this was a couple years ago, and now they've populated these mountains. Where we lived on the Oregon coast was pretty sparsely populated. It was mostly forest, and I mean, we had elk come through the yard, that kind of thing. So he looked at me like, sounds plausible. Now, the reason I did this is because, or where I got the idea, not long before that, I had read a newspaper article. That's back when there were still newspapers. And it was titled, Monkeys Invade Osaka, Japan. And they really did. It was a story about how the monkeys in Japan came out of the mountains in the winter into Osaka, and they were attacking people. They were stealing people's pets and eating them. And in the article, it even said people were told to keep their small children indoors and to not let their small pets outside until the authorities could deal with it. And I thought, weird. I'm glad we don't have monkeys invading our home, but it made a good story. Here we are, Japanese mountain monkeys. And he goes, so they've been living in the hills. And I go, yeah, you know, they've been living in the hills, and they thrive here because the climate is a lot like where they come from. And they have no natural predators. I mean, they climb the trees. Cougars can't get them. Bears avoid them. And they eat, you know, possums and squirrels. And I bet that mountain monkey was out here eating roadkill because, you know, they have like carnivore teeth. And he was like, oh, yeah, sounds about right, Dad. That's a pretty good story. Well, anyway, we laughed about it and got home, and, you know, he shared it with Mom, and she thought it was disgusting. And we just went on with life. Now, about a week later, I'm working on a home project on a Saturday, and I'm in the hardware store. I need some drywall screws. And I'm standing in line. Now, the hardware store was a special place in a small town. For one, it had a popcorn machine. And two, it was in the middle of town. And three, that's where all the old guys just kind of hung out, because anytime you start a project, you got to go to the hardware store just to see if there's something you need. Well, Phil, the owner, we knew him. He's a good guy. He brought the popcorn machine to our daughter's wedding reception. That was fun. Anyway, I'm standing there with my bag of Ace Hardware popcorn, and there's guys in front of me waiting to check out, and I have my handful of screws in a little bag there. And I hear one guy say to his old buddy in front of him, goes, "Hey, did you hear about those Japanese mountain monkeys?" And my ears went ding, and he goes on, he goes, "Yeah, they got off of chip ships on Coos Bay. They've been running through the woods, and they've come down now toward Bandon." And he goes, "People are finding them dead on the road." And I thought, where did, and then he goes on, he goes, "Yeah, they're big, they're mean." He said, "I don't think I'd go out in the woods without a firearm if I were you, because hunters have been seeing them in the woods." And I thought, wow, this is kind of funny. So I just kind of smiled and thought, that's weird. And I got my screws and I rode my longboard home. And then I asked my son later that day, I said, "Bud, remember last week when we went to town and bought your pants?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "Remember that story we made up about the Japanese mountain monkey?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, Dad, that was a good one." I go, Did you share that with anyone?" And he goes, "Well, you know, yeah." I said, "Who?" He goes, "Well, there's a couple guys that, you know, like to tell stories, and I didn't have a good story, so I just told them that one." Well, it ends up, we created an urban legend that lasted several months. We heard it several times. It even ended up in the little local newspaper that it was not real, that it was actually raccoons that were attacking and eating old ladies, cats, and Bandon. So, next time you make up a road trip game, you never know where it might go. Do you have Japanese mountain monkeys where you live?